I think predictably, are a number of wedge issues emerging to drive the coalition crazy as it attempts to get its footing in the new administration. So the administration has been very forward-thinking during the transition and this does not look like any previous transition to me. Now, maybe that's that we are more focused on it, this having been a very contentious election won by a surprisingly dynamic coalition. But we're seeing a lot of activity from this administration that tells us a lot about where they are headed and where they are not headed. We see a couple of fissures developing. I will talk about two. One of them has to do with the sudden prominence of concern over food safety, largely driven by the sudden rise to prominence of Calley and Casey Means.
Calley
And Casey Means. So they rose to prominence very suddenly. They wrote a book called, I think, Good Energy or something like that. But their rise to prominence really, as far as I can tell, began with Tucker Carlson's interview of Casey Means, the female. They are siblings.
I think he talked to them both.
Did he?
I think so.
Oh, well, forgive me.
Every time I've seen them, they've showed up. All of the big places they've showed up together.
I've seen some independent stuff, but anyway, maybe I've forgotten what Tucker's interview looked like. But nonetheless, a discussion with at least Casey Means, who went to medical school, did not finish her residency, left medicine, and is now advocating in MAHA style for a major revision in the way we think about food and novel compounds. And a lot of it sounded fantastic to many of us because those of us who've been thinking about the issue of the degradation of the food supply and all of that, we've been focused recently on pharma and the dangers that come from various pharmaceuticals, but seeing MAHA take on this food health bent initially seemed very, very positive. The fissure that has developed surrounds the fact that suspiciously to many of us in all of what is said by the Means siblings, and I wish there was an easier way to refer to them, it's awkward construction, but the Means siblings seem very focused on food and strangely not focused on the lessons of COVID and pharmaceuticals, especially the dangers of the mRNA vaccines. And that is giving many of us alarm because we have worked very hard and faced terrible stigmas and pushback over the mRNA vaccines. And what we do not want to happen is to see all of that effort diverted into a needed pushback on the dangers of big ag and big food that lets pharma off the hook to poison us again. So that's a fissure, a predictable one. And it has me thinking a lot about, first of all, is the fissure even organic? There is something interesting about the sudden rise of Calley and Casey Means.
Yes, there is.
Nobody knows what it means. I'm not going to level any accusations, but it is interesting that these two came from relative obscurity and find themselves at the pinnacle of MAHA in a position to advance a very important case that just so happens to obscure another very important case. And they're doing so at a moment at which pharma must have seen the writing on the wall and be searching desperately for any escape from what Kennedy and the rest of us in the medical freedom movement have been advancing. So, what is the solution here? Are we to go after each other because, those of us on the medical side of it suspect those of us on the food side of it of attempting to deflect attention away from the villains over in pharma? that seems like a very bad plan. And I would point out that it is quite typical for an insurgent movement like the medical freedom movement to be fractured by agents that are introduced to create chaos, to create distraction, and to create division where there wasn't any. And the sudden emergence of the mean siblings has done just that, whether that was the intent or not. Recently, Calley means had the issue put to him directly as to whether or not he would agree that the mRNA shots should be banned or pulled from the market, and he refused to say so, which was interesting. Those of us who've been tracking the hazard of the mRNA vaccines find this hard to fathom. And I will just in passing say one thing that I would advise our audience to change about the way they approach this is the framing is everything. I have been in many battles with many of the high quality academics who still exist in the system, who have become awake to the hazards of the vaccines, who are themselves very cautious about, the idea of banning the vaccines. Do we really want to ban the vaccines? Do we want to tell people they can't have them? Right? What about the extreme cases of people who are super vulnerable to COVID who might get a benefit out of these things? I think this whole thing is wrong-headed. What we know is that the so-called vaccines were authorized under false pretenses, that the trials themselves were heavily compromised, did not show what we were told they showed, and that this isn't a question of banning something so that you can't have access to it. It's a question of simply applying the system that we all agreed to. We have a system in which we test pharmaceuticals for safety and efficacy. It was violated here. These things should be pulled from the market for everyone because they shouldn't have been on the market in the first place. You shouldn't have access to these things because they didn't do the steps that would have been necessary to put them on the market legitimately. So I don't think there is any issue of banning. This isn't an issue of banning. This is an issue of simply doing what we say we do, right? And in this case, they were released without the proper safety checks. They shouldn't be on the market at all, and that's the correct position. However, that position that I've just outlined, which I would say is my position, is in conflict with multiple different factions over in MAHA unity space. It is in conflict with President Trump, who wants credit for Project Warp Speed, and I do think that at some level he can take credit for Project Warp Speed without taking credit for these terrible inoculations, right? Project Warp Speed is something that brought inoculations to market incredibly fast. Maybe he's not getting enough credit for that. But the inoculations that were brought to market, which obviously he's not a biologist making vaccines, right? He's not responsible for that. But in any case, what do you do about the fact that the president-elect can't acknowledge the hazard of the vaccines? The MAHA movement is laser focused on the danger of the vaccines, and we have to figure out what to do going forward when we don't exactly agree on their nature. And what I want to propose is that there is a proper way to deal with this so that we don't have to decide between going after food safety and going after pharma safety. We don't have to decide whether to sacrifice what we've learned about the COVID vaccines because the president has a particular amount of pride around the way they were brought to bear on the so-called pandemic. That the right way to deal with this is actually very simple. And I'm worried that the purists, who I understand, but the purists, people who've been focused on the factual questions surrounding safety and efficacy, surrounding the pandemic, how much threat there actually was from it, those people who have been focused on those things are not ready. In fact, many are unwilling to think in political terms because it's a compromise. They've got a very clear picture of what happened and what it means and how much danger, how much harm. But the idea of stepping into a realm where you inherently have to compromise that story in order to reduce the harm going forward is anathema to them. So I'm worried that the purists are going to kibosh anything that isn't their own perspective, and that their perspective can't work for all the reasons I've been pointing out. So here's my proposal. And again, I certainly am with the purists to the extent that we know the story. That's what I think is the right thing to do. But the way to deal with the political realities of this situation comes in 3 parts: informed consent and liability. And my point about this is, first of all, informed consent, as I've pointed out here many times, is a principle that is so deeply ingrained that after World War II, after Nuremberg, we literally hanged 7 doctors for violating this principle, even though it had not yet been codified. It is now formally codified in the Nuremberg Code, and we are now routinely violating it. We are not informing people about what it is that we are, in many cases, mandating that they take, and we are not allowing consent. We are strong-arming people into taking things that they shouldn't take, or that they should at least have the option not to take. So if we insist on informed consent across all domains, you have a right as a human being to decide what you will and what you will not accept. Now, the language of informed consent from Nuremberg specifically speaks to experimental treatments. I would argue that in light of complex systems, all of this stuff is experimental, right? You know, the fact that it takes decades to figure out that yellow number 5 or Ozempic or whatever it's going to be,
Bovir, appeal,
has some negative effect, doesn't mean that that was just some shocking error. It means that in general, if you intervene in a complex system, you're going to discover down the road that you had consequences you did not anticipate, meaning that all of this stuff is inherently experimental if you're going to give it to people or farm animals or spray it on food or whatever. So informed consent and liability starts with informed consent. That means we have to know what it is that we are going to be consuming. We have to be able to know where it is. We have to be able to know what is known about it. We have to know what is not known about it. And we have to be able to say no. I want you to think about all of the problems that it would solve if we had agreement on that. Let's take appeal. I don't know where appeal is. I am told that it is in a brand of apple cider vinegar, organic apple cider vinegar that we have been using. I don't know if that's just a vicious rumor, if that's really true, but the point is, I have a right to know if appeal is in that vinegar, and I have a right to say no, right? You can't hide it from me by not putting it on the label. That's a violation of informed consent. Okay? mRNA. Okay, I know it's in those damn shots. I don't know what else is in them. I needed to know that there's an SV40 promoter in the shots because of the shell game that was played with the various production modalities. But I have a right to know where mRNA is, and that means not just the shots. I also have a right to know if you've inoculated a beef cow or some dairy cattle that I'm going to get meat or milk from. And I have a right to say no.
Yep.
Right? You have to tell me it's in there, and then I have a right to say no, and you don't get to belittle me for exercising that right. You don't get to tell me, but the science says this or that. I'm a human being. I was born with a right not to eat stuff that I don't want to eat, and that means you have to tell me where it is. Okay? So if we had informed consent and liability, then that would cover all of the cases across pharma and food. You tell me what's in it. I tell you whether or not I accept it. You don't get to question my judgment, right? Mm-hmm. That's effectively almost everything the purists would want, but in a form that the libertarians can accept, at a form that President Trump can accept. All right. The third part, so informed consent is 2 parts. The third part is liability. Now for
Wait, I'm sorry, I'm confused then. I thought informed consent and liability were the first two parts.
no, informed consent and liability. Informed, I need to know
Oh, informed
what it
and
is.
consent.
I need
Okay.
to get to say no. And then liability. The manufacturer has to be liable in a normal sense in court for harm done to me. Okay? That, if you think about what it is that is supposed to make us safe, our system is supposed to be made safe by testing that happens before stuff emerges into the market. And then you're supposed to be able to force that testing to be high quality because the manufacturer doesn't want to be caught having done a poor quality safety test and then facing you in court after they've injured you. That is what makes the system work. The removal of that by the Reagan administration for vaccines has created a landscape in which pharma does not have the normal incentives to avoid harming you. In fact, it came to my attention this week. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it, but the fact that there is no liability for these things actually gives an incentive for the manufacturer to not discover harms, right? They are actually incentivized not to do
Sure.
the safety testing that they would do for another pharmaceutical because they don't want to know. If they had liability, they would want to know because they don't want to get caught having done harm that they are then going to pay billions of dollars for in court. So, informed consent and liability would restore a system that works. It would allow anybody who believes they want access to these things once they have passed licensure to get it, but it would cause manufacturers of things like unsafe vaccines to take them from the market themselves out of enlightened self-interest in a business context. So my claim is the way to mend the fissure in MAHA and to make politically tenable all of the things that we want is informed consent and liability across all of food manufacture, agriculture, and pharma, and then let the system function the way it is supposed to function. The one way that this does not get everything we want is that one can imagine, under that rubric, that there will be things which will be recommended to those who do not find themselves in a position to question properly, where they will be technically informed, but they will not have the tools to process what they've been told, in which they might end up taking things. And I don't want to see that harm either, but it seems to me that in exchange for getting safety across food, ag, and pharma, that this is the best conceivable approach, because anything else is going to result in us tearing each other apart and not getting even a fraction of the value that would come from this approach.
I'm in.
All right. Awesome. So that's MAHA. The other thing that is going on, Fisher-wise, over in the Unity Coalition, the Unity Coalition really being kind of MAGA, MAHA, and Unity Rescue the Republic style